Tens of the strangest unsolved hospital mysteries. There are few places in the world where a person feels more vulnerable than a hospital. Some strange, unsolved mysteries have taken place inside hospitals. While most of them are tragic, some of them may actually be considered genuine, unexplained miracles. 1. The disappearance of Joan Gay Croft. It came without warning, raining hell down upon everyone in its path. In a land accustomed to death descending from the sky, the Woodward tornado of April 9, 1947, still ranks as the deadliest ever to hit Oklahoma. In its wake were the bodies of 185 dead, more than 1,000 injured, and a mystery that remains unsolved 60 years later. What happened to 4-year-old Joan Gay Croft, who was taken from the local hospital by two unidentified men in the aftermath of the horrendous storm? A few days earlier, a warm Pacific low had come ashore, and collided with a strong cold front near Amarillo, Texas. Winds just north of Amarillo were clocked at more than 100 miles per hour. 6 major tornadoes dropped out of a storm many described as resembling an atomic mushroom cloud. The twister that ravaged Woodward first touched ground near Canadian, Texas. Its base measured 2 miles across, and it retained the killer dimension for 6 hours, as it traveled for 100 miles at speeds reaching 50 miles per hour. At 7 p.m. it hit Glacier, Texas, and some 14 miles from Canadian, killing 16 people and destroying 25 structures. In nearby Higgins, the tornado destroyed all but 3 buildings. A woman who had crawled under her bed for safety was sucked up into the wire bed springs when the tornado passed directly over her house. She was one of 45 people killed in the town. Though Glacier and Higgins were devastated, no word of the approaching disaster reached the Oklahoma towns just across the border from the Texas Panhandle. It was the 3rd day of a national telephone strike, and only emergency operators were running the switchboards across the country. Grace Nix and Bertha Wiggins were the operators on duty in Woodward when they received their first warning. The operator in Shattuck, Oklahoma, fewer than 20 miles from Higgins, called to ask if they were all right. From Shattuck, the operator was watching a massive black cloud make its way toward Woodward. A few minutes later, a second call came in from the small town of Sestos to the south. "There's a dark cloud over Woodward," the Sestos operator told the 2 women. "It looks terrible." The time of the call was 8 p.m. At 8:15 the tornado leveled the small farming town of Gage, 21 miles southwest of Woodward. The 2-mile-wide funnel rapidly churned through the sagebrush of western Oklahoma, chewing up 60 farmhouses and killing 8 people as it raced northeast toward Woodward. As the distinct funnel form came upon Fargo, the next farming town, 8-year-old Leroy Fenimore ran up Main Street shouting, "We're going to have a tornado." He had heard about tornadoes but had never seen one. Seconds later Fargo was leveled. Woodward was only 12 minutes away. Many in the community of 5,000 had remarked on just how muggy the air was that night. Otherwise, it was an ordinary Wednesday evening. Churches held services and other activities. The 2 downtown movie theaters were filled with high school students. Ingrid Bergman was starring in Rage in Heaven at the Woodward Theater while the Terry Theater was showing The Devil on Wheels. Down the street a few blocks, the local pool hall had its usual patrons. The high school band had just finished practicing for its trip to Alva, Oklahoma, the next day. 2 students stayed behind to practice a little more as Paul Nelson got on his bicycle and headed home. Dr. Joe Dewar, head physician at the 28-bed Woodward Hospital, was walking into Gill's Cafe for his ritual cup of coffee as Irwin Walker drove past on his way to work at the power plant on the north side of town. The wind was blowing hard now. Large raindrops spattered the sidewalks, followed by hail. Paul Nelson was getting soaked as he pedaled harder against the wind, the hailstones striking his back. As the tornado passed over Experimental Lake on the west side of town, it sucked up watercolor dread by the clay soil typical of Oklahoma. The level of the lake dropped by a foot. The time was 8:42 p.m. At the power plant, Walker saw the funnel coming directly at him. Live electric lines were snapping all across Woodward. Walker threw the master switch, cutting off the town's power, just as the tornado struck the building dead center. Walker was killed, but his act was credited later for saving countless lives. George McLaren usually stayed at the pool hall until 11 p.m. but as he was about to walk inside, He noticed the fully grown trees in the nearby park, bending all the way to the ground. He flagged the taxi and headed for home. At his cafe, Gil Gillard had just refilled a customer's cup. The rat-tat-tat of falling hail got everyone's attention. Gillard turned to look at the barometer hanging on the wall. It had bottomed out. Then the lights went out, and Woodward fell into pitch black save for the violent electrical storm, directly overhead flashing brief images all around like massive strobe lights. McLaren's taxi was buffeted by the strong winds as it zigzagged down residential streets, to avoid downed trees and power lines. But when McLaren stepped out of the taxi, everything was calm. No wind, no hail, no rain. Then he noticed the leaves of the trees rushing straight up into the night sky. He ran across his back porch and into the house just as the porch enclosure was torn away. McLaren screamed for his children to get down as he ran into the living room. There was a thunderous roar, repeatedly described by survivors as sounding like a freight train coming down on them. McLaren's son, Gaynor, watched the top of the room's walls separate from the ceiling, fall back into place and then separate again before the windows imploded. He soon found himself lying in the front yard, rain hitting his face. His father was standing on the rubble that had been their home trying to find Gaynor's younger brother, Merritt, in the debris. A chill filled the air as sleet and snow began falling. The t-shirt Gaynor had put on for bed was now covered with his own blood. He walked over to his father to see if he could help. George McLaren was pulling loose boards from the pile in a panic to find Merritt when he looked down at his bloodied son. "Are you all right?" George asked. Gaynor nodded and his father replied, "Go find help. Hurry." Gaynor ran in the direction of the large fires illuminating downtown. It was now just before 9 p.m. By this time, Paul Nelson, who had been pelted with red mud from Experimental Lake as he rode his bike home, had gotten into the bathtub to scrub the strange mud off when there was a sudden deafening roar. He looked up to find his house had been lifted away. All that was left was the floor and young Paul sitting naked in the bathtub in the reddish rain. The attached plumbing had prevented the bathtub from going with the house. His friends who had stayed late to practice at the high school were not so lucky. Their bodies were found in the rubble a few days later. What sounded like a roaring train could be heard inside both the Woodward and Terry theaters, as well as explosions and screams for help. People tried running out the front door but were stopped by theater staff. One man who made it out of the Terry Theater was picked up by the wind and hurled down the block to his death. Suddenly the building's roof gave way, and people ducked under the theater seats, whose stiff metal backs kept the fallen ceiling from crushing them. A large, bulky air conditioning unit broke through a rear door, enabling some to escape into the night. Elsewhere, one mother heard the tornado coming, and tried to go to her children's bedroom. Without warning, a wall collapsed and pinned her over a lit heating stove. She could feel her back beginning to burn. Desperate, she grabbed at the curtains of a nearby window, yanking them down and stuffing them behind her to snuff out the fire. Downtown was ablaze as factories, warehouses and the grocery store were in flames. Trees were torn out of the ground. Deadly debris filled the air, falling along with the hail, snow and reddish rain. Streets were blanketed by rubble, bodies, power lines and downed trees. Telephone poles and timber beams were driven into the walls of the Woodward County Courthouse. Above, the sky rippled with an unearthly lightning display. The 2-mile-wide tornado leveled 100 city blocks with wind speeds ranging from 225 to 440 miles per hour. It exited to the northeast, traveling close to 45 miles per hour toward the Kansas border. There were no fatalities along its new route, but 36 more farmhouses were destroyed in the darkness and 30 more people were injured. Somewhere to the west of Alva, the Woodward tornado lifted back into the storm cloud that had generated it. In Woodward, Dr. Dewar took charge of the hospital that was filling with people, the majority of them children, many of whom had compound fractures. "It just broke your heart," Dewar said later, looking at the children and prioritizing who should be treated first. The Baker Hotel was quickly converted into a hospital for those with minor injuries. The hotel's windows had been blown out by the storm, but the building was structurally sound, and eventually there were 2 patients for every bed. All the patients were covered with mud from Experimental Lake. There was no running water, however, to clean wounds, wash patients or flush toilets. One girl's eyes were so heavily caked with mud that it pinched an optic nerve, and she was left blind for several weeks. Dewar held an infant covered with slivers of wood. The child looked like a cocklebur, he said of the baby who died soon afterward. Also, he could do nothing for a badly injured young woman in a house across the street from the hospital. 2x4 had impaled her near the pelvis. The front lawn of the hospital was transformed into a temporary morgue as trucks started going up and down residential streets to collect the dead. The night after the storm, 2 men dressed in khaki army uniforms came into the hospital and asked for Joan. As they started to carry her out, Joan cried, "I don't want to leave my sister." One of the men was overheard telling her not to worry. They promised to come right back for the older girl. Joan's protests drew the attention of the hospital staff, who challenged the men. One of them said they were friends of the family and were simply taking Joan to another hospital where her family was waiting. The men were allowed to leave with the child. Joan Gay Croft was never seen again. When he learned that Joan had been taken, Owen Croft, still not entirely recovered from his injuries, hurried back to Woodward. He and Joan's grandfather, Raymond Goebel, went from town to town posting flyers and placing missing persons ads on local radio stations. Goebel died soon afterward, however, of a massive heart attack. For the next 40 years, Owen Croft scoured one small, dusty High Plains town after another, following up on a tip, a hunch, a rumor of where Joan might be. He died in 1986. In 1994, the NBC TV series Unsolved Mysteries aired a story about Joan Croft. Within 48 hours, Joan's aunt received more than 200 telephone calls with potential leads to her long-lost niece's whereabouts. One was particularly intriguing, a woman living in Phoenix, Arizona, who had the same blood type as Joan and whose left leg was scarred in the same place where Joan had been injured on the night of the tornado. A Croft family member even stayed with the woman for 2 weeks and was convinced that almost 50 years of searching had finally come to an end. But DNA tests showed that the woman was not related to the Crofts. The Croft family never speculated publicly as to the identities of the 2 men or why they took Joan. But local researchers K.P. Simpson, who interested unsolved mysteries in the story, and his son, Rick, developed a few theories of their own. First, Owen Croft had some money. He wasn't what you would call wealthy, said Rick Simpson. But he was better off than most were in Woodward at the time. Joan could have been kidnapped for ransom, but no ransom demand has ever surfaced. The second theory is that Joan's mother's family might have taken her after learning that Clyda had been killed. You have 2 men walking into the hospital and asking for her by name, said Simpson. How would they know her name? And why did the men ask for her by name and not her half-sister? According to Simpson, Woodward authorities and Owen Croft himself questioned Clyda's family. They found nothing to suggest that the family knew anything about Joan's disappearance. To this day, Joan Gay Croft's whereabouts are unknown. 2. The Ann Arbor Hospital murders. 2 nurses, both citizens of the Philippines, go on trial in federal court here tomorrow, accused of being the killers who terrified a Veterans Administration hospital at nearby Ann Arbor in the summer of 1975. In a 6-week period of that year, between 51 and 63 patients at the hospital suffered respiratory failure. 13 of them died. The government has accused the 2 nurses of systematically injecting Pavu ion, a powerful muscle relaxant, into intravenous fluids that the patients were receiving. The drug has similar effects to curare, the vegetable poison used by Indian tribes in South America to paralyze prey. Is used medically to relax patients who are about to undergo surgery and can cause death by suffocation if not administered properly. A New Jersey doctor was charged last year with murdering 5 patients with injections of curare in 1965 and 1966. Federal officials have not publicly told of a motive that they think was behind the wave of poisonings, which turned the operating wards of the 300-bed hospital into a medical nightmare for more than a month. However, the prosecutors have said that they will attempt to prove that the 2 nurses felt they were overworked. The case has attracted considerable attention in the Philippines, and the government of that country is sending an observer to Detroit to monitor the trial. A defense lawyer said today that sympathizers in the Philippines and in this country had raised $90,000 for a defense. Benvenido Lanada, the assistant Philippine consul general in Chicago, will attend the trial for his country. He said that about $30,000 of the defense fund had been donated by United States residents. He said that about 12,000 Filipino nurses are working in the United States. The accused nurses are Leonora M. Perez, 32 years old, and Filipina B. Narciso, 30. Both worked on the 4 p.m. to midnight shift at the hospital. Miss Narciso is unmarried. Mrs. Perez is the wife of a computer mechanic, Epifanio Perez, and the mother of 2 small sons, Christopher, 4, and Jeffrey, born last November after she was indicted. Government prosecutors said last summer that the 2 nurses might have been only part of a wider conspiracy to murder patients at the Ann Arbor Hospital, but no one else has been accused. Thomas O'Brien of Ann Arbor, a lawyer for Ms. Narciso, said that the government's evidence is wholly circumstantial, and that many other employees of the hospital had the opportunity to administer drugs to the stricken patients. The government had planned to call as witnesses 2 patients, who had undergone questioning under hypnosis to testify about events leading up to their seizures. One of the patients later died, however, and last week the government said that it would not call the other patient as a witness. In addition to using hypnotism, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents also used computers to analyze the poisonings in their 18-month investigation. 4 bodies were exhumed for tissue examination as medical investigators tried to determine the reason for the mysterious deaths. Miss Narciso and Mrs. Perez originally were accused, in June of last year, of 5 murders, 10 attempted murders and conspiracy to poison patients. Last February 1, these charges were dismissed and they were re-indicted on 2 counts of murder, and 8 counts of attempted murder and 1 count of conspiracy. A week ago, the government dismissed a charge that the nurses had poisoned Richard Neely, the only recovered victim who was said to have seen the persons who poisoned him. The government did not explain why it was dropping the charge that Mr. Neely had been poisoned by the nurses. Under hypnosis, Mr. Neely identified Mrs. Perez as the nurse who was tending him when he began to suffocate. But, in the same hypnotic session, he also said that a stocky black man and another nurse had adjusted the intravenous equipment attached to his arm. If convicted, the 2 nurses could be sentenced to life imprisonment. Both say that they are innocent. In August 1975, there was criticism from some members of the families of patients at the Ann Arbor Hospital that the mysterious attacks had been going on for several weeks, before hospital officials began a formal investigation. A statistical study made by medical experts at the University of Michigan showed that the rate of respiration failures in the hospital was at least 6 times what it normally would have been. An official investigation did not begin until August 15, 3 days after there had been 8 respiratory failures in the intensive care unit in one night. Hospital officials have said that because many of the patients admitted to the hospital were extremely ill, the rate of respiratory failure and cardiac arrest might be expected to be high. In the first 6 months of 1975, the officials said, the rate averaged about 5 or 6 a month. The trial of Miss Narciso and Mrs. Perez has been delayed twice, once so that Mrs. Perez could give birth and the second time, after defense lawyers accused prosecutors of not opening up investigative files. The prosecutors were ordered to do so by Federal District Judge Philip Pratt. Lawyers have estimated that the trial may last 4 months. They expect the selection of a jury selection to take at least 2 weeks. The 2 defendants have been in the United States about 6 years. Miss Narciso worked at a hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, before coming to the Veterans Administration Hospital in Ann Arbor 3 years ago. Mrs. Perez worked at the University of Michigan Hospital, before joining the staff of the Ann Arbor Hospital. 3. The disappearance of Bonita Chamberlain. Chamberlain was last seen between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock a.m. on February 23, 1978, leaving Sacred Heart General Hospital in the vicinity of 13th Avenue and Hilliard Street in Eugene, Oregon. She had given birth on February 13 and was released from the hospital, but her baby daughter remained hospitalized due to prematurity and low birth weight. Chamberlain went to the hospital that day to nurse the baby. She was told she could take her home sometime after 1:30 p.m., and telephoned a female friend to tell her the good news. She has never been heard from again. Her mother reported her missing at 1 o'clock a.m. on February 24. At 2:30 a.m., That day, Chamberlain's purse was found lying on the ground in a parking lot on the University of Oregon campus. Shortly after 5 a.m., her blue 1966 Mercury Comet was found in the parking lot of a Coca-Cola bottling factory on Franklin Boulevard, near the hospital. There was no sign of her at the scene. Chamberlain was in the process of a divorce at the time of her disappearance. She was separated from her husband, and lived in the 20 block of Howard Avenue. Her older two daughters lived with their father. She had worked as a maid at the Holiday Inn on Coburg Road for approximately 5 months before she went on maternity leave. Her co-workers said she was well-liked and a reliable employee, and she was also described as a dedicated parent, who would never have left her 3 children, the oldest of whom was 7 years old in 1978. She is a graduate of Churchill High School. Her case remains unsolved and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance are unclear. After nearly 40 years, there is still no trace of Bonita Chamberlain. 4. The Toronto Hospital for Sick Children infant deaths. For decades, Phyllis Trenner lived under a cloud of suspicion as the nurse believed to have killed all those babies at SickKids. She tried to fade into the background, working in occupational health for a large corporation, raising her 2 kids on her own, emerging rarely to protest her innocence. Not too long ago, Deputy Police Chief Tony Warr was contacted by the coroner's office with news about a prime suspect from his past in the homicide squad. They thought he'd want to know if Trenner had the answers to solve the 30-year-old mystery. She had taken them to her grave. As we mark 30 years since that shocking March 1981 when we were told a killer was stalking the hospital for sick children, so many of the key players are gone in what remains the city's greatest mass murder, or most perplexing confluence of coincidence. And with each passing year, the chances of ever knowing what really happened on cardiac wards 4A and 4B slip further away. It's a grim anniversary the renowned hospital certainly doesn't want to acknowledge. Despite a request, they had no one available to comment. The death shift can be traced back to June 30, 1980 when 18-day-old Laura Woodcock died unexpectedly on Ward 4B. By March 1981, 32 more babies and 3 children would die on that combined unit, a 625% increase over similar 9-month periods in the past, with most passing suddenly between the witching hours of midnight and 6 a.m. Only one of 4 nursing teams was present for all the deaths. When tested, many of the infants had such deadly high levels of the heart drug digoxin that experts at the time concluded that it couldn't be accidental. 2 pediatric nurses would be alternately fingered as the silent angel of death. For daring to ask for a lawyer, petite Susan Els would be arrested on March 25, 1981. But at the preliminary hearing the following year, the Crown's case fell apart. Nels had been off-duty when one of the 4 babies died, and on holidays when another of the suspicious deaths occurred. All 4 murder charges were dropped, and she ultimately received $190,000 in compensation from the Ontario government. The witch hunt then turned on Trenner. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta identified her as the only one present for all 29 of what it classified as suspicious deaths. Despite her vehement denials during 8 televised days on the stand, she was unofficially tried and convicted during the sensational 15-month, $2.8 million Royal Commission headed by the late Justice Samuel Grange. Grange concluded in his 1984 report that at least 8 babies and possibly as many as 23 had been murdered by an overdose of digoxin during the deathly quiet night shift. He never named a suspect. He didn't have to. But since then claims of flawed testing, hasty police work and scientific advancements have seriously challenged Grange's conclusion that foul play was involved. Researchers have since insisted the sky-high readings found in the babies weren't digoxin at all, but digoxin-like immunoreactive substances or LIS, substances in the body often mistaken for the heart drug, especially in infants. "I've never believed there were any murders there," Dr. David Seckham insists today from Vancouver, where he first made his LIS findings more than 2 decades ago. As for the high digoxin levels found in the exhumed infants, they've since been completely discredited because no controls were used during the experimental testing. "I was never convinced that there were murders," says lawyer Elizabeth McIntyre, who represented the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario at the inquiry. It's ironic that just as Grange said he might eventually be proven wrong. Mounting scientific evidence that an epidemic of death had never occurred gave Tranner a new lease on life. When we met 15 years ago in her Etobicoke home, she was battling cancer but asked that her condition not be mentioned in the article. Instead, the mother of two wanted to concentrate on her relief that the cloud of suspicion was finally thinning. It's very, very difficult when people think these terrible things about you, the divorced mom explained at the time. You go into nursing to help and to heal, and then to have us accused of this horrendous crime against infants? It was devastating. But Nels, known by her married name Susan Pine, was far less optimistic than her former colleague. She knew the police would never reconsider their belief that a killer had been at work. It would mean they would have to admit publicly that they made a horrible mistake, the respected nurse and mother of three said at the time from her Beauville home. And as she predicted, 30 years later, the SickKids' deaths remain classified as unsolved murders, with their unofficial suspect dying before the mystery could finally be solved. 5. The miraculous recovery of Owen Thomas. In many near-death experience stories, a patient is brought to a hospital with slim expectations of survival, then makes a miraculous recovery. However, few of these recoveries are more unlikely than that of 20-year-old Owen Thomas. On December 16, 1981, Owen saw his friend being attacked on a New York street corner and intervened to help. Stabbed 3 times in the chest and abdomen, Owen's heart, liver, and gallbladder were punctured. By the time anyone ran over to help, his intestines were hanging 20 centimeters, 8 in, out of his stomach. Owen was rushed to Beekman Downtown Hospital. When he arrived, his body had already lost so much blood that his chances of survival seemed non-existent. Owen's heart stopped beating, and he had no pulse or blood pressure by the time doctors went to work on him. Owen's bowels had also been severed by the stabbing, so his intestines were covered in feces. Although Owen was clinically dead for over 5 minutes, somehow he survived several hours of surgery. Doctors feared that the long period of oxygen deprivation would cause serious damage to Owen's brain, but he was completely coherent when he woke up and displayed no negative after-effects. Owen's recovery defied all medical logic. Everyone involved thought it was a genuine miracle. Later, Owen described a vision of entering heaven, where he encountered his older brother, Christopher, who had died in a car crash 2 years earlier. According to Owen, Christopher pushed him out of heaven. "We don't want you," Christopher had said before Owen woke up. Owen Thomas's unlikely recovery remains one of the more miraculous near-death experiences on record. 6. The disappearance of Philistine St. Cyr. More recently is the strange vanishing of 66-year-old Haitian immigrant Philistine St. Cyr, of Immokalee, Florida. In April of 2006, St. Cyr was admitted to NCH North Naples Hospital after being airlifted there for an unspecified medical emergency. The next morning he was reported as having made a full recovery, after which he was put in a taxi for a ride home. When they reached Immokalee, St. Cyr claimed that he did not know the address, or at least couldn't explain it because he did not speak English, so the cab driver drove him back to the hospital, where the staff put him on a bus instead, which would take him practically to his front door. He was reported by hospital staff as being on his way into the bus station, and that was the last anyone ever saw of him. Investigators have been trying to track him down ever since, without any success. So mysterious is the whole thing that it is not even known if he ever got on any bus at all, although there is some evidence to show that he seems to have actually entered the bus station and was making preparations to go home. Considering that the man did not speak English and could not drive, it was assumed he could have not gotten far, but he has managed to evade all attempts to find him ever since. One of the most popular theories is that St. Cyr simply wandered off and managed to get hopelessly lost. There have been hints that he might have suffered from dementia to some extent, but it is not clear how much this affected him or what it could have had to do with his vanishing. Another idea is that he had grown tired of his life in the United States and headed back to Haiti, but there is serious doubt from those who knew him that he could have been capable of doing this on his own. No indication that he would have wanted to leave his family in the United States behind, and once again there is no evidence of it at all. How could this older man who suffered mental issues and could not speak English so thoroughly manage to elude such extensive efforts to find him? Where in the world did he go? Thus far, there is no clue at all as to what happened to Philistine St. Cyr, and he has never been heard from again. Hospitals are where we go when we are ill or injured in order to leave them healed and complete. Yet for some they are places that have been their final destination, before passing into the realm of strange disappearances and vanishings. Where did these people go and what happened to them? How could they so completely and so suddenly disappear, often right there in their own hospital rooms, under the watchful eye of medical professionals? With no clues and no trace of the whereabouts of these individuals, it seems that they will remain enigmas for some time to come. 7. The murders of Patricia Maddox and Joyce McFadden. Two Ohio detectives flew to Miami on Wednesday as authorities here, and in Columbus re-examined the violent deaths of the wives of the two men killed in the FBI's bloodiest shootout. The head of Metro-Dade County detectives termed as unfounded speculation the theory that William Maddox, 34, and Michael Lee Platt, 32, killed each other's wives. But Major John Farrell said authorities aren't ruling anything out, as they seek more information on the two who last Friday battled FBI agents, who had recognized them as suspects in a string of violent bank and armored car robberies. They killed 2 agents and wounded 5 others before they were killed. Columbus Police Captain Antony Lanata said by telephone Wednesday that Platt is now considered a potential suspect in the December 30, 1983, slaying of Maddox's first wife, Patricia, and another woman at the hospital where the women worked. And Metro-Dade detectives met with officials of the medical examiner's office to study the December 24, 1984, shotgun death of Platt's first wife, Regina, which was ruled a suicide. She was killed Christmas Eve 1984 by a 12-gauge shotgun blast to the head. Farrell said Platt was home at the time, and told police his wife had been despondent about marital problems. It still appears to be a suicide. But we have reopened it, Farrell said. He said it was unusual but not unprecedented for a woman to kill herself with a shotgun. The Columbus detectives sent here will search the dead men's suburban homes for evidence that could link them to the 1983 stabbing deaths of Mrs. Maddox and Joyce McFadden, lab technicians at Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus. I probably should be charged with incompetence if we didn't take a hard look at Mr. Platt, to see if he was ever in Ohio, whether there is anything to connect him with our homicide, Lanata said. He figures into our case because he has been established as a close friend of Mr. Maddox, and it would be a terrible understatement to say he was among the class of people who kill other people. He said Maddox's alibi at the time was that he was home with their infant daughter. Detectives felt suspicious about him, but never had any evidence to charge him in the case, Lanata said. We found very minor inconsistencies in what he had told us. There was something about his demeanor that is not in keeping with that of someone whose loved one was brutally murdered. But that doesn't make someone a murderer, Lanata said. No charges were ever filed in the slayings. The Columbus Dispatch has reported that Maddox collected a $350,000 life insurance policy for his wife's death, and also had filed a $3 million wrongful death suit last December 30 against the hospital. The suit was still pending. After his wife's death, Maddox purchased a new car, motorcycle, many household items and expensive clothes, the Dispatch reported. Both Maddox and Platt remarried, but Maddox's second wife had been seeking a dissolution of their marriage. Metro-Dade police recovered a pickup truck Wednesday that they believe was used by the two men March 12, when they apparently went to an isolated quarry, shot a target shooter, then stole his car and left him for dead. The man survived, and his car was being driven by Maddox and Platt last Friday when they were spotted by the FBI, investigators said. The pickup was parked at an apartment complex in the southwest Miami suburb where the shootout raged. A search of Maddox's house after the shootout turned up a gun belonging to Jose Collazo, the target shooter, 3 other guns, a walkie-talkie and clothes that could have been used as disguises, the FBI said in a news release Wednesday evening. 4 weapons also were found in a similar search of Platt's house, the FBI said. In Brunswick, Georgia, FBI agent Benjamin Grogan, 53, was buried Wednesday. FBI Director William Webster and hundreds of law enforcement officers attended his funeral service Monday in Miami. Webster also attended the funeral Tuesday of slain agent Gerald Dove in Charleston, 8. The Dr. X killings. On a Saturday afternoon 50 years ago, a 4-year-old New Jersey girl named Nancy Savino developed a stinging bellyache that prompted her visit to Riverdale, a small private hospital in Oradell, NJ, not far from her Bergen County home. It seemed to be appendicitis. Dr. Stanley Harris operated that same night, March 11, 1966, and removed intestinal cysts that had caused a painful blockage. The procedure went flawlessly. A surgeon who visited Nancy the next morning later said, her condition was excellent. But 24 hours later, Nancy was discovered dead in her hospital bed. An autopsy revealed no medical explanation, so her death was ascribed to an undetermined physiological reaction. Her devastated parents grieved as the child was laid to rest in a pink dress at Mitrust Cemetery in Mahwah. 9 years later, a Long Island woman who dabbled in writing got the tip of a lifetime. A source told her that a New Jersey doctor in the mid-1960s had gone on a murder spree that was never disclosed. The woman, Eileen Milling, knew she was in over her head. She sent a 3-page letter to the New York Times suggesting that someone look into the case of a surgeon with a warped mind playing chess with other people's lives. Reporter Myron Farber learned that the doctor in question had worked at Riverdale Hospital, and was dismissed shortly after Nancy Savino had died. In January 1976, Farber published an expose implicating Riverdale's former chief of surgery, identified as Dr. X because he had not been charged, in the unexplained deaths in 1965 and 66 of perhaps 20 surgical patients, including 4-year-old Nancy. Dr. X's mode of murder was alleged to be high-dose injections of curare, a muscle relaxant that paralyzes respiratory muscles. All the victims had been patients of other surgeons. Remarkably, Farber disclosed that the allegations had been leveled against Dr. X in 1966. Sleuthing by Dr. Harris, who lost 5 patients, showed that Dr. X had been in proximity to each before they died. Harris searched Dr. X's locker and found a smoking gun, 18 mostly empty vials of curare and used syringes. Bergen prosecutor Guy Calisi led a brief and secretive investigation that was concealed from the press and never presented to a grand jury. Investigators bought the surgeon's preposterous explanation that he had used the curare on dying dogs. Dr. X's colleagues were stupefied. "People don't die from nothing," said Dr. Alan Lands. Calisi had moved on to a judgeship in 1970, but his successor, Joseph Woodcock Jr., took a fresh look at the Riverdale deaths, thanks to Farber. Bodies of some of the unexplained dead were exhumed, and traces of curare were found in at least 3 of them, including Nancy Savino. Dr. X was unmasked when he was indicted for murder in May 1976. He was Mario Jaskelevich, 48, a diminutive Argentine who had emigrated as a young doctor in 1955, and spent 20 years as a New Jersey surgeon, earning a reputation as able but abrasive. His motive seemed as implausible as the dying dog alibi. Riverdale had hired new surgeons, including Dr. Harris, after growing from 50 beds to 81. Woodcock believed Jaskelevich opposed expansion of the surgical staff, and killed the patients to make the new hires look incompetent. Among others, his alleged victims included little Nancy, Carl Rohrbeck, 73, a hernia patient, 3 women who died after routine gallbladder surgery, Frank Biggs, 59, an ulcer patient, and Eileen Shaw, 36, who died after a successful cesarean section birth. Their kin had never been informed of the 1966 investigation. Jaskelevich's hack-and-sack trial set a record as the longest in state history. The courtroom drama was at times overshadowed by a sidebar legal story. Raymond Brown, the doctor's heavy-hitter attorney, subpoenaed Farber's notes. He hoped to make a case that prosecutor Woodcock colluded with the reporter against Jaskelevich to burnish their own reputations. Judge William Arnold surprised the journalism world by ordering Farber to comply. When Farber refused, Arnold ordered him jailed. Meanwhile, the prosecution had a tall task in reconstructing evidence from events a decade past. Murder charges were winnowed down to 3 victims, Savino, Rohrbeck and Biggs. Conflicting, complicated medical testimony about poisons and toxicology turned the courtroom into a chemistry lab on some days. After 34 weeks of listening to complex evidence, The jury took just 2.5 hours to set Jaskevich free. The trial's end also meant freedom for Arbor after 40 days in jail. Stripped of his medical license on unrelated malpractice charges, Dr. X scurried home to Argentina, where he worked as a surgeon, until his death from a brain hemorrhage in 1984, at age 57. Riverdale Hospital, bankrupted by the Dr. X publicity, was demolished the same year that Jaskevich died. The New Jersey Court of Public Opinion concluded that Jaskevich got away with murder due to the flawed, furtive probe in 1966. Could an adherent to the Hippocratic Oath really murder a little girl and many others? Hey, it happens. As Herbert Keenel, a psychiatrist who has documented many homicidal doctors, wrote in the British Medical Journal, medicine has arguably thrown up more serial killers than all the other professions put together, with nursing a close second. 9. The disappearance of Tavish Sutton. Wednesday's attempted abduction of a baby from Southern Regional Medical Center had a good ending, when an alarm system and hospital employees thwarted the kidnapping, but that wasn't the case nearly 19 years ago, when 1-month-old Tavish Sutton was taken from a downtown Atlanta hospital. Despite a $10,000 reward, and hundreds of interviews by Atlanta police and the FBI, Tavish, who was recovering from minor surgery when he was abducted, from Grady Memorial Hospital's Hughes Spalding Pediatric Unit, on March 9, 1993, was never found. "We never really had any good information," Atlanta police did. Sheila Cumberworth told the AJC in 1998. Tavish was in the custody of Family and Children's Services when he disappeared. Neither his mother, who was being treated for schizophrenia at a mental institution at the time, nor other family members were considered suspects in his kidnapping. The boy's mother, Wanda Sutton, filed suit against Grady in March 1995, claiming the hospital was negligent in not preventing the kidnapping. The hospital settled out of court for $600,000 in 1996. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children still has a file open on Tavish, who would now be 18 years old. The file includes photos showing what Tavish might have looked like at age 4 and last year at age 17. According to the John Rabin, Executive Vice President, and Chief Operating Officer of the center, Tavish was one of 281 infants abducted nationwide since 1983, that the center has documented. Rabin said that 129 of those cases involved babies abducted, from healthcare facilities, with 5 of those children still listed as missing. 10. The miraculous recovery of Chucky McGivern. In December 1982, 7-year-old Chucky McGivern was admitted to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and diagnosed with a rare disease called Reye's syndrome, which attacked his brain, liver, and nervous system. Chucky soon went into a coma, and his family was told he only had a 10% chance of survival. Hoping for a miracle, Chucky's mother pinned a medal to his bed featuring the likeness of St. John Newman, a noted religious figure who became the Bishop of Philadelphia during the mid-19th century, and was eventually canonized by Pope Paul VI. For whatever reason, the presence of this medal seemed to pave the way for a series of miraculous events. The medal containing St. John's likeness had been threaded to a safety pin alongside 2 other medals. But on numerous occasions when Chucky's mother returned to the room, she discovered that the medal had been unthreaded and turned face down. Things got even stranger when a picture of St. John was found taped to the wall. No one from Chucky's family or the hospital staff admitted to doing these things. An unidentified boy also kept showing up in the ward, entering Chucky's room, and interacting with his family. Whenever security was called, they couldn't find this boy. No one ever saw him entering the hospital, either. 4 days after falling into his coma, Chucky suddenly woke up and made a miraculous, unlikely recovery. He described a dream in which he saw this same, mysterious boy standing over him. After Chucky was discharged from the hospital, his family made a trip to the shrine of St. John Newman and saw a painting of St. John when he was 12 years old. He looked exactly like the mysterious boy everyone had seen at the hospital.